Hello, this is Glastonbury Romance. It must have been about an hour later that the discreet Emma was serving tea in her immaculate kitchen to these pretty wearers of Abel Twig's nosegays. Emma was also dressed in black, but over her dress she wore a spotless white apron, and upon her head, the most carefully brushed and tidied head of Glastonbury, she wore an old-fashioned cap trimmed with a handmade lace. Emma, unlike her visitors, had never made any attempt to copy her mistress's manners or speech. Emma's manners were dignified, but they were those of one who, as she always expressed it, knew her place, and her speech was as local as a man-drip quarry. She was the kind of servant who, in place of losing herself in her employer's fortunes or way of life, made of those things the background for her only resolute character. The character of Emma was not eccentric like that of Penny Pitches. Emma detested eccentricity. She was no worshipper of the aristocracy either, like Red Robinson's mother. What she really was a strict professional, and her profession was that of the perfect servant. In Tillycrow she had found that she considered to be the perfect mistress. Mrs. Phillips's deplorable limitations, obvious to all the rest of the world, were not limitations at all to Emma. They were virtues high and rare, and for the sake of these virtues she was as devoted to this neurotic and shrewish recluse as any old-fashioned lawyer's clerk was ever devoted to a narrow-minded, petty-flogging scrivener. In this great turbulent universe, wherein ships at sea, certain farms of land, certain soldiers, camps, certain outposts of civilization, conducted under scrupulous authority, become oases of order in the midst of chaos, the miniature politely entitled The Elms, ruled over by Emma and Tillycrow, was in its own way almost without rival. The kitchen tea party, which was now proceeding, which would have been as much disturbed by the presence of any of that gentry who were contemporaneously taking tea in Tilly's drawing-room, as any of Tilly's guests would have been had Emma, in place of answering the bell, sat down on the sofa beside her mistress. But the domestic rituals in the drawing-room under the rule of Mrs. Phillip was no less punctilious than the ritual in Mrs. Phillip's kitchen under the rule of Emma. In between these two women, on this nice professional point, there was a uniformity of opinion too deep to be expressed in words. Their mutual ideal was, as a matter of fact, as different from the aristocratic way of taking things as it was different from the proletarian way, or from the easygoing, lower-middle-class way of Mr. and Mrs. Jerd. It was upper middle class, and not for nothing does one note that it has been from houses conducted under the Emmas and the Tillys of life that such characteristically English characters as Charles Darwin and Horatio Nelson have projected their world-shaping opinions and their heroic deeds. Indeed, it might have with justice be said that two oases of perfect order and peace, and two alone exist in Glastonbury at that epoch: the draper's shop of Mr. Wallop, the mayor, and the home of Tillycrow. Outside these harbors of tenant and mortised security, everything ebbed and flowed. There was, so to speak, the Parmenidean rafts of stillness in the Heraclitean flux of Glastonbury life. These were. The lights had been lit in both drawing-room and kitchen before the visitors departed. In other houses they would not have been lit. In other houses people would have been too absorbed in talk, too enamored of the twilight, to have sent for lamps and candles, or thought of closing shutters, drawing curtains, pulling down blinds. This closing out of the twilight was indeed a characteristic Norfolk habit. The great green curtains in Norwood Rectory were always had been drawn close for years when twilight began. So no doubt had the old Vikings, when they landed at Wick, gathered around their bivouac fires and turned their backs to the ghostly druidic lights lingering in the west. This closing of the shutters at the elm was in fact a Norse custom. All the West County servants hated it, except Emma, whose own people, in their high madcap farms have practiced the same habit. Well, Tilly Crow's guests were William Zoylan, who tonight was to be transported to Wookiee Hole in Mr. Barty's airplane, and Dave and Persephone Spear, who had arrived that morning from Bristol and taken lodgings in High Street. William Zoylan rather enjoyed the thought of a couple of months' showmanship in Wookiee Hole. A descendant of a long line of attendants upon kings, there was nothing unpleasant or undignified to Will in the office of Lord Chamberlain to a subterranean river. Yet another cause of the delicious feeling of well-being that flowed through him at this moment was the frank and shameless delight he took in the society of the dark-haired girl now occupied in amusing their hostess. The man he was talking to was Nell's half-brother, so he had every justification in treating the husband as cavalierly and the wife as gallantly as he pleased. There was indeed something piquant about keeping up a conservative argument with a passionate enemy of society, while at the same time he played the courtier with the opponent's lady. The more deeply he got entangled in argument with Dave, the more frankly unashamed were the glances of admiration which he bestowed upon Persephone. He experienced at this moment a feeling as if, with that firelight warming his great limbs and the boyish hips of his curly-haired girl warming his proud soul, there was nothing in heaven or hell he wouldn't enjoy facing. If the cropped skull and patient eyes opposite him were to condemn him to the guillotine at dawn as a cumberer of the earth, he'd still be happy. If this enchanting girl would slip into the bedroom tonight and dress before his eyes and be off before he touched her, he'd still be happy. If he knew we were to be compelled that very evening to eat a basket full of otter's dung while Sam Decker embraced Nell before his eyes and they both mocked at him, he'd still be happy. There's something almost awful, he said to himself, using these exact words, about my power of enjoyment. I believe I could enjoy smelling a bunch of violets if it were on the rack. He began lazily throwing into his retorts to Dave's careful logic a little spice of the savage aplomb. And as his roving blue eyes caught the fact that the treacherous girl was listening and even encouraging him, they commenced to darken in the candlelight with feline zest. But the sense of having carried the proletarian gun fallen into the very heart of the enemy's camp was inspiring. Dave Spear that evening, beyond his wont, it was not long before both of the women, as well as the little life-loving adventurer, were gazing at him in reluctant respect. It was when he dropped his logic and became oracular that this crop-headed, prosaic young man swept the field. Nature is on our side, he was saying, and the dark, blind, unmoral, creative tidal wave. The inarticulate masses of mankind are only beginning to wake up. The millions of the Orient are only beginning to wake up. We use reason, and we all prepared to use force without a shred of compunction. But in reality, we are only the mediums of destiny. Communism is the destined next phase of evolutionary planetary life. Nothing can stop it. That is why the stupidest, the silliest, the clumsiest among us has something that you vainglorious individualists completely lack. We are the still, small voice of the next phase. We may be unimaginative, undistinguished, lacking in all sense of humor. We may even be inhuman. We can afford to be when no one else can afford to be, for the simple reason that we are the solidifying of the intention of evolution. While this argument was going on in the most perfect of upper-middle-class drawing rooms, in the equally perfect kitchen of somewhat familiar discussion was proceeding. Destiny found its voice here, however, in the dreamy, sentimental utterances of Lily Rogers. Louis and Emma both strongly upheld the view that the longer the existence of Nellie Morgan was kept secret from Mrs. Crowe, the better it would be for all. Lily, on the other hand, advanced the startling and disturbing doctrine that since things which are hid are fated to become known, and things which are dark are fated to be made clear, this was the girl's own phraseology, it would be kinder to make Mrs. Crowe acquainted with the sad truth. This kindness presented itself to the temporizing, mendip-bred mind of Emma Sly as itself to the plain cruelty. and a controversy began between them that almost spoilt the taste of Emma's famous pear ginger jam in the connoisseur mouth of Louis. Thus, in both drawing room and kitchen of the Elms, there gathered on the horizon certain clouds of danger to the master of the house. In the one case, these vanguards of evil omen were held off by Lord P.'s bastard. In the other case, by the daughter of Amos Sly, Lord P.'s shepherd. But in either case, for all the closing of shutters against the blue twilight, were the clouds altogether dispelled. They did not advance, but might fall, leaving them undispersed. Perhaps the two persons in all Glastonbury who caught most fully the essence of this cool blue twilight, falling at the end of so unnaturally a warm day, were Matt Decker and Miss Elizabeth Crowe. The vicar, upon whose conscience it was to enter every house in the town, had invaded the domain of Dr. Sodbury, the parson of St. Benignus. Miss Elizabeth had already done what she said she would do at the reading of the will in Northwold Rectory. She had taken one of the smaller of all the town council's workmen's houses, a tiny little place with a tinier little garden, with the word rosemary inscribed on the top of the wooden gate. Here she lived with a little maid of 18 called Tossie Stickles, the plumpest as well as the most good-tempered young woman who ever put on an apron. She paid Tossie 5 swillings a week, and every penny of this Tossie put into the savings bank to bide there till she was bedded or buried. Miss Elizabeth had seen Matt Decker's tall figure passing down the street, and had sent Tossie to call him in to partake of an early tea. No one but Matt Decker himself knew the effort that it cost him to accept this thoughtful invitation. He particularly wanted to finish his visiting in Benedict Street in one afternoon, and Penny expected him back to his own high tea, for they dined early, at 6:30. He was counting on an afternoon quite free with visiting on the morrow, for a treasured walk with Sam over to Burleywood, beyond the village of Street, which was a favorite objective of his. And this summons from Rosemary meant not only the spoiling of his appetite for his evening's meal, which he enjoyed more than any other, but made it likely enough that in place of this excursion he would have to return tomorrow to this row of little houses. Once launched, however, in a deep colloquy with his old friend, he began to feel that neither of these sacrifices was wasted. Miss Crowe was the only woman he could confide in all Glastonbury, on the point where he most wanted feminine advice, and he found himself, as he sat opposite her in the bow-winded side by side with boxes of yellow pansies, talking more freely to her than he had done to anyone for years. Not only did Miss Elizabeth forbid Tossie to touch the window blinds, but she even opened one of the windows when she saw her friend arrested by the beauty of the evening. Thus together they sipped their tea, inhaling the fragrance of the yellow pansies, and were soothed by the mystical blueness in the air. So we have a nice compare and contrast there with the upper class who are putting on the lamps to hide the darkness, and these people who are embracing it. And we've also passed page 200. We're in fact on page 202 now. So we have, I believe under 1,000 pages now. So wow, we're getting some headway here. But until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.